Hey College Success, this is your video for your Chapter 6 lecture. So this chapter is about study, memory, and test taking, which in a lot of ways, this is kind of the basis for a huge chunk of your time in college. A huge chunk of time that you spend on academics is taking notes so that you can study them, remember them, and then take a test on them. So this is a really, I think, integral chapter for that reason. So here are your beginning of the chapter questions. Like always, do you set enough time aside to prepare for test? Do you cram? And if you cram, does it usually work for you? Do you prefer all-nighters? Is that helpful to you with the adrenaline and sense of urgency? And then do you study your notes and highlights, but you still don't feel like you're doing well? So those are just things to be thinking of as we go throughout this chapter. So the goals of the chapter to talk about kind of memory and ways to strengthen your memory, study techniques, and then test taking strategies, as well as dealing with test anxiety. So here are some questions to consider as it relates to memory, just knowing how memory works, the difference between short-term to long-term memory. Are there obstacles? What obstacles are there to remembering? What approaches, should you memorize things, should you not memorize them, and how can you improve both long and short term? So here, you've probably seen something very similar to this before, where it's going to talk about 3 basic steps. We encode, we store, we retrieve. Now, technically, we can remember something forever. It can be there. The problem is we sometimes have trouble retrieving it. So it's not that it's not there, we just can't pull it out. And that's because maybe we did not go through these steps when we remembered the information, or we just never practiced it because it was something we learned a long time ago, and so it just goes to the far corners of our brain, if you will. But encode means how you take the information in. This is why it's important to know about your learning styles, because when you encode, if you can use your best learning style or as many senses as possible, you're going to have a better time understanding that information. Then you're going to store it either in short term or long term, and then you're going to be able to retrieve it. So I'm going to talk about each of these a little bit more in depth here. So whenever you are trying to remember things, usually this comes up as issues. Like the lack of sleep can really have an impact on your memory. And then cramming, some people think that they get good results from cramming because they'll cram the night before and then they do really well on the test. Well, okay, that's great if you have a Chapter 1 test and you cram the night before, you do well in Chapter 1, but then you have a unit test that has Chapter 1, 2, and 3 on it, and all of a sudden you cannot remember Chapter 1 because you did really great with your short-term memory when you crammed, but it did not translate to long-term memory. So that is sometimes an obstacle in remembering. So we have to make sure that we're aware of that, especially if we know we have to remember information down the road. So here are some tips in your textbook here. If you go into memory, it's going to talk about different functions of memory. Again, here's that model: encoding, storage, retrieval. Our working memory is short term, but it's like when we're actively performing or working on a task. So it's like something that is currently you're thinking about. Short term is just within those, few minutes, not a very long period of time. Can you remember? It gives the example of like, where did you leave your keys? So that's your short-term memory. And then of course, long-term memory is something from the past. And sometimes they say like sense of smell is like one of your strongest ways to activate your long-term memory. So we just talked about obstacles to remembering, cramming. If you are a crammer, I encourage you to look at that part again, because I know a lot of people do think cramming works, and it seems like it does in the short term, but long term it actually has some negative impacts to it. So what are some ways that we can work on our memory? So that's what the next section is going to kind of transition into, the studying. So one of the things also our textbook talks about is memorization alone enough? So for instance, sometimes you do have to remember just basic ideas or basic words, which is okay. But then the problem is if you don't understand those things in context or in connection to other ideas, then memorization starts to fail you. So you have to kind of do a little bit more with that. So this kind of lends itself right into studying, because obviously when you study, you're trying to work on your memory and use strategies. So one of the first things is making sure that you are avoiding distractions. I know we've had like journals and discussion posts for you guys, discussion posts and things that talk about like how can you have an area that is distraction free, or what can you do to make sure that you are studying in a way that's going to be beneficial. So avoiding distractions, your phone, your devices, people around you, and that comes into play with controlling your study environment. So all of that starts with preparing to study, making sure that you have the right atmosphere for it, making sure that we don't have these things that are going to distract us. Here are some myths when it comes to studying and why we might have trouble remembering what we've studied. We might be multitasking. Multitasking is okay for like general life activities. Like, you're preparing a meal while you're watching TV or talking on the phone. But whenever you are in an academic situation, multitasking is actually detrimental. Multitasking overtaxes your brain, and while you might think you get things done more quickly, it actually produces lower quality work, and it can actually take more time. Myth 2 with studying and remembering is highlighting is useful. Well, yes and no. If you are just highlighting just to highlight and you're not really actively engaging, really trying to find the main ideas, reading the section and then going back and highlighting or revisiting your highlighting, then it's not as useful as it should be. And then studying effectively is effortless. No, when you study, it should take some effort. Like, it's not going to be just really easy. So here are some study strategies that are also going to tie into memory, making sure that you are remembering things in a way that is going to be helpful. So I'm going to look into this section right here to look a little bit more. The first thing it talks about is mnemonics. And so this is where, if you remember these, like Roy G. Biv, PEMDAS, Homes for the Great Lakes, those are some very common mnemonics. So if you can come up with a mnemonic to help you remember a concept or ideas or formulas or whatever that might be, that is a great way. So remember back a few slides ago when we encode information, if we store it in a way that makes sense to us, if we have a mnemonic, or if we are able to associate concepts together or have idea clusters, if we're able to organize information in a way that makes sense, it stores it more easily. It's easier to retrieve it. If we're just remembering things kind of willy-nilly, it's going to go into our mind and our memory very disorganized, and it's going to be more difficult to pull it out of our memory. So here are strategies that our textbook really does talk about. And any of these, if you were talking about like acronyms, rhyming, songs, anything like that also helps. Anything that's going to allow you to either like come up with some cute, funny ways to remember information. Some students, it's called picture superiority effect. If you can remember an idea with a visual, that is usually one of the most powerful ways, because our mind tends to remember pictures. And if you can associate pictures and ideas together, that is going to be really helpful with memory. So looking at these different study strategies. These are also study strategies: spacing, interleaving, and practice testing. So spacing is kind of what it sounds like when you study. So this is an example of like a calendar, studying every other day or studying for half an hour or 30 minutes. Interleaving then is whenever you are kind of like cycling through, it's like what you're studying. It's mixing up the content. So you might read chapter 1 one night and then go back 1 and 2 and then 1, 2, 3. So like you're covering everything, but you're not just studying the same thing over and over again. You're allowing your brain to kind of take that information in like little clusters. And then practice testing. One of the best ways to practice retrieving is to do a practice test. So, and test might not actually be a test. It could be flashcards. So Quizlet or physical flashcards where a friend is helping you. So it can be flashcards. It could be a practice test or a study guide, something like that. But the more you practice retrieving information out of your long-term memory, the easier it's going to be for you in a testing situation. So those are some study strategies that are also helpful. You also need to know like what works for you and what doesn't work for you. Know your instructor's teaching style. Don't limit yourself to just thinking this is the way you've always done it, so this is the way you have to do it. I had a student one semester years ago who used flashcards for vocabulary, but he was not getting very good results. And I said, well, how are you studying? He said, I've always used flashcards, but I've always struggled. I said, well, have you thought about trying something different? And so he was an audio learner. And so what he started to do was read the words out loud to himself, read the definitions out loud to himself, have someone else read them to him. And slowly he started to see his vocabulary scores improve because he was really relying on the strategy that best fit him. So you have to know like what's a good fit and what is not when it comes to studying. All right, and then the last section starts to talk about test taking, again, because this all kind of flows together, making sure that you are, taking in information, you're remembering it, you're working with it, and now you're going to be assessed over it. which college is full of assessments, right? So the more you can remember and study, the better your test taking is going to be in theory, because we know sometimes things happen, we get anxiety. So here are some just very basic ways, and as always, like in your textbook, this gets a little bit easier to read right here. So these are easy ways to study and prepare for tests, even without getting really heavy, right, at first. Make sure you read the lessons, right? Go through the material, go to class, take notes, review those notes. Then this is the key one to me, study regularly. So if you know you have a test in 2 weeks, you shouldn't wait till 2 weeks from now. You should be studying a little bit every night, 10 minutes night 1, 10 minutes night 2, then 15 minutes, then 20 minutes, so that you are building that foundation. And that's also going to help with that anxiety feeling because you've spent so much time invested in that. Go back and reread anything that is significant or has some maybe questions or confusion for you. Learning and talking about material with other people is really powerful because they might see it or explain it from a different perspective that might be helpful to you. There's that testing. Take a practice test, maybe time yourself, especially if you have a writing, like an essay test, time yourself and see how long it takes you, and rest. That comes into play. I know it's easier said than done sometimes. Get enough rest. So the rest of this talks about like whole person approach to testing, making sure that you are really looking at the big picture. Look at your time management, your energy management, your sleep, your eating, all of that, because all of that's also going to play a role in your testing situation. So you also want to have some realistic expectations. You want to prioritize, set your time, and then the rest of this goes into like tips leading up to and then on the day of and after. So arriving to class, you want to get there a little early if you can, because you're allowed, allow yourself a couple minutes, just breathe, get all your materials ready, take a little walk around the hall if you need to, kind of release some tension. When you take the test, listen to directions, both oral and written, making sure that you know exactly what's expected of you. One of the biggest things I see students do is they just don't follow directions. They skip over, like if there's part A and part B, they forget to do part B. So make sure that you follow directions. As soon as you get it, look it over. Look to see, maybe what sections you're going to have to spend more time on. Come up with a plan and decide how you're going to allocate that time, especially if you have like a very specific time frame. And then jot some notes down if you need to. Here are some more test day questions, test day strategies. Answer every question on the exam, even if you're not sure. Don't leave it blank. Read every question carefully. Cover up the choices if it's multiple choice. Anticipate what the answers are and then look at them. Skip difficult questions and go back, because sometimes we can trip ourselves up thinking about a difficult question and spend valuable time thinking it over. Skip it. Go to the questions you know and then go back to the more difficult questions and just check it over. Anxiety is real. We do have test anxiety. Our brain goes into fight or flight mode. That is common. And so sometimes we have to just take these, progressive muscular relaxation, like tense up your toes all the way up to your eyebrows, work your muscles, tense them, release them, take a walk, take some deep breaths, make sure you've eaten and slept and drink all those things. But also you can help yourself with test anxiety by doing what I said before, studying a little bit every night leading up to, making sure you're prepared. So there are steps to kind of overturn that anxiety. Obviously, if you do none of those things, then the anxiety might be worse. So that's why you want to do as many things as you can to make sure that you are kind of combating that. All right, and then after the test, what you want to do is look at it, make sure that you know what went well, what didn't go well, so you can adjust for future assessments. And while you may or may not have tests in your career, we're all assessed in some way. It might be some kind of evaluation with your boss, it might be some kind of clinical experience. So we do have to kind of be prepared for those situations. All right, so as always, I encourage you to go in and maybe spend a little bit more time on a specific area that you need a little bit more attention, and let me know if you have questions.